Okay, here we are at part 4 of The Alchemist. So he's hopped on the caravan on his way to Egypt. He's going to meet an Englishman and an alchemist. And in your digital copy, if you want to follow along, it's from page 36 to 47. After this video, I'm going to post a shorter one, obviously, of the summary that will help you on your questions, because I know it's a lot. And so I'll just summarize what I've read in this one, but I still want you to watch this one first, because like I said, it's better to hear the real text first before reading the summary. Okay, guys? All right, so we're meant to start. Oh man, I'm not on the right page. So it's 36, and it starts with the Englishman was sitting on a bench. Okay, so Santiago is now on his way to the pyramids, right? He decided that he's going to at least try to fulfill his personal legend. The Englishman was sitting on a bench in a structure that smelled of animals, sweat, and dust. It was part warehouse and part corral. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this, he thought, as he leafed through the pages of a chemical journal. 10 years at the university, and here I am in a corral. But he had to move on. He believed in omens. All his life and all his studies were aimed at finding the one true language of the universe. First, he had studied Esperanto, then the world's religions, and now it was alchemy. He knew how to speak Esperanto. He understood all the major religions as well, but he wasn't yet an alchemist. He had unraveled the truths behind important questions, but his studies had taken him to a point beyond which he could not seem to go. He had tried in vain to establish a relationship with an alchemist, but the alchemists were strange people who thought only about themselves and almost always refused to help him. Who knows, maybe they had failed to discover the secret of the masterwork, the philosopher's stone. And for this reason, they kept their knowledge to themselves. He had already spent so much of the fortune left to him by his father, fruitlessly seeking the philosopher's stone. He had spent enormous amounts of time at the great libraries of the world, and he had purchased all the rarest and the most important volumes on alchemy. In one, he had read that many years ago a famous Arabian alchemist had visited Europe. It was said he was more than 200 years old, and that he had discovered the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. The Englishman had been profoundly impressed by this story. But he would have never thought of it more than just a myth, had not a friend of his, returning from an archaeological expedition in the desert, told him about an Arab that was possessed of exceptional powers. He lives at the Al Foyum Oasis, his friend had said, and people say that he is 200 years old and is able to transform any metal into gold. The Englishman could not contain his excitement. He canceled all his commitments and pulled together the most important of his books, and now here he was sitting inside a dusty, smelly warehouse. Outside, a huge caravan was being prepared for a crossing of the Sahara and was scheduled to pass through the Al Fayoum. I'm going to find that damned alchemist, the Englishman thought, and the odor of the animals became a bit more tolerable. A young Arab, also loaded down with baggage, entered and greeted the Englishman. "Where are you bound?" asked the young Arab. "I'm going into the desert. the man answered, turning back to his reading. He didn't have any conversation at this point. What he needed to do was review all he had ever learned over the years, because the alchemist would certainly put him to the test. The young Arab took out a book and began to read. The book was written in Spanish. Oh, who do you think this person is? That's good, thought the Englishman. He spoke Spanish better than Arabic, and if this boy was going to the Al Fayoum, there would be someone to talk to when there were no other important things to do. That's strange, said the boy, as he tried once again to read the burial scene that began the book. I've been trying for 2 years to read this book, and I never get past the first few pages. Even without a king to provide an interruption, he was unable to concentrate. So we can all relate to that, right? Like when you're not into a book, it's really hard to get into it in the beginning. He still had some doubts about the decision he had made, right? Because he could have gone back with the sheep. He could have gone back home with the sheep, or he could have gone in pursuit of the pyramids. But he was able to understand one thing. Making a decision was only the beginning of things. Right, guys? So a lot of you guys have made your decisions now, like what you're going to do for your personal request project, but just because you made a decision doesn't mean that, like, the rest is going to fall into place and now it's going to be all easy, right? When someone makes a decision, he is really diving into a strong current that will carry him to places he had never dreamed of when he first made that decision. So you're going to discover as you do these personal quest projects, like, even though you wrote down in journal entry 2 what your expectations are and what the obstacles are, you're still going to run into things that you didn't expect, right, in the process. When I decided to seek out my treasure, I never imagined that I'd wind up working in a crystal shop, he thought. And joining this caravan may have been my decision, but where it goes is going to be a mystery to me. Nearby was the Englishman reading a book. He seemed unfriendly and had looked irritated when the boy had entered. They might even have become friends, but the Englishman closed off the conversation. The boy closed his book. He felt that he didn't want to do anything that might make him look like the Englishman. He took Urim and Thummim from his pocket and began playing with them. The stranger shouted, "Urim and Thummim!" In a flash, the boy put them back in his pocket. "They're not for sale," he said. "They're not worth much," the Englishman answered. "They're only made of rock crystal, and there are millions of rock crystals in the earth. But those who know about such things would know that those are Urim and Thummim. I didn't know that they had them in this part of the world." "They were given to me as a present by the king." "By a king," the boy said. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he put his hand in his pocket and took out 2 stones that were the same as the boy's. "Did you say a king?" he asked. "I guess you don't believe that a king would talk to someone like me, a shepherd," he said, waiting to end the conversation. "Not at all. It was shepherds who were the first to recognize a king that the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. So it's not surprising that kings would talk to shepherds." That's nice to say, right? And he went on, fearing that the boy wouldn't understand what he was talking about. "It's in the Bible. The same book that taught me about Urim and Thummim. These stones were the only form of divination," like divine practice, "only form of divination permitted by God. The priests carried them in a golden breastplate." Remember, guys, the king had the golden breastplate, and that's where he produced the stones out of them. Oh yeah, that reminds me. Another thing I really wanted to do for my personal quest project was to read the Bible, because I've never read the whole Bible cover to cover. And maybe I'll do that in the summer, but I just feel like if I read the whole Bible, then I won't want to read all the papers I have to grade. So meditation's a little easier than reading the whole Bible. Anyway, the boy was suddenly happy to be there at the warehouse. "Maybe this is an omen," said the Englishman half aloud. "Who told you about omens?" The boy's interest was increasing by the moment. "Everything in life is an omen," said the Englishman, now closing the journal he was reading. "There is a universal language understood by everybody but already forgotten. I am in search of that universal language, among other things, and that's why I'm here. I have to find a man who knows the universal language. An alchemist." Remember, that's the name of this book, right? So we're getting towards the climax, probably. This is the rising action, right? The conversation was interrupted by the warehouse boss. "You're in luck, you two," the fat Arab said. "There's a caravan waiting, leaving today for Al-Fayoum." "But I'm going to Egypt," the boy said. "Al-Fayoum is in Egypt," said the Arab. "What kind of Arab are you?" "That's a good luck omen," the Englishman said after the fat Arab had gone out. "If I could, I'd write a huge encyclopedia just about the words luck and coincidence. It's with those words that the universal language is written." Do you remember, guys? That's so much like Slumdog Millionaire. The luck and the coincidence thing. He told the boy it was no coincidence that he had met him with Urim and Thummim in his hand. And he asked the boy if he too were in search of the alchemist. "I'm looking for treasure," said the boy, and he immediately regretted having said it, but the Englishman appeared not to attach any importance to it. "In a way, so am I," he said. "I don't even know what alchemy is," the boy was saying when the warehouse boss called them to come outside. "I'm the leader of the caravan," said a dark-eyed, bearded man. "I hold the power of life and death for every person I take with me. The desert is a capricious lady, and sometimes she drives men crazy." Guys, so he says the desert is a capricious lady. He's comparing the desert to a woman, so that is a metaphor, right? And your last question was, the answer was a simile, because it was comparing one thing to the worker ants, remember? And it used the word like in it. There were almost 200 people gathered there, and 400 animals, camels, horses, mules, and fowl as in birds. In the crowd were women, children, and a number of men with swords at their belts and rifles slung on their shoulders. The Englishman had several suitcases filled with books. There was a babble of noise, and the leader had to repeat himself several times for everyone to understand what he was saying. "There are a lot of different people here, and each has his own god. But the only God I serve is Allah." So he's like a lot of Arabs are of the Islamic faith, right? So that's their faith. "And in his name I swear that I will do everything possible once again to win out over the desert. But I want each and every one of you to swear by the God you believe in that you will follow my orders no matter what. In the desert, disobedience means death." Right, guys? So in the desert, it's dangerous. Like, there's wind storms, there's water shortages, there's, like, no hospitals that you can, like, phone and say, "Oh my gosh, my friend is dehydrated," right? You're just, like, stuck in the middle. You can have hallucinations, like, there's a lot at risk, right? There was a murmur from the crowd. Each was swearing quietly to his or her own God. The boy swore to Jesus Christ, right? He's Christian. Remember, he was brought up by priests. Well, his parents wanted him to be a priest, so he's a practicing Christian. The Englishman said nothing. So, the Englishman is, like, devoted to the language of the universe and alchemist, so, maybe that's what he believes in. And the murmur lasted longer than a simple vow would have. The people were also praying to heaven to protection. A long note was sounded on a bugle, and everyone mounted up. The boy and the Englishman had brought camels and climbed uncertainly onto their backs. Has anyone ever ridden a camel? It's like not comfortable. You have to straddle the hump, and it's not a fun experience, at least in my experience. The boy felt sorry for the Englishman's camel, loaded down as he was with the cases of books. Poor camel. "There's no such thing as coincidence," said the Englishman, picking up the conversation where it had been interrupted in the warehouse. "I'm here because a friend of mine heard of an Arab who—" But the caravan began to move, and it was impossible to hear what the Englishman was saying. The boy knew what he was about to describe, though, the mysterious chain that links one thing to another, the same chain that had caused him to become a shepherd, that had caused his recurring dream, that had brought him to a city near Africa to find a king and to be robbed in order to meet a crystal merchant and... Okay, I'm just going to read that sentence again because that sums up Santiago's whole journey so far. So, like, if I were to ask you to draw a map of his journey, which I think I am going to do, you guys can work in pairs, like towards the end, drawing a map of his journey. So it's the same chain, right? So you'd want to make it in like a circle that caused him to become a shepherd, that caused his recurring dream, right, about finding the treasure in Egypt, that brought him to a city near Africa, remember, in like Morocco. But first to find a king, right? First he met Melchizedek, and to be robbed, right? Then that young boy that took him under his wing, like took everything that he had, in order to meet a crystal merchant, and now he's here, right, in a caravan on his way to Egypt to see the pyramids. Whoa, this is really, really, really important, this line here. I think I'm going to write it down in my journal, actually. I'll highlight it for you guys in this text. So, the closer one gets to realizing his destiny, the more that destiny becomes his true reason for being, thought the boy. Okay, wait, I'm going to make that green so that you know that it's like a good one, okay? The closer one gets to realizing his destiny, the more that destiny becomes his true reason for being, thought the boy. So the boy is learning a lot. He's becoming quite spiritual. The caravan moved toward the east. It traveled during the morning, halted when the sun was at its strongest, and resumed late in the afternoon. The boy spoke very little with the Englishman, who spent most of his time with his books. The boy observed in silence the progress of the animals and the people across the desert. Now everything was quite different from how it was that day when they set out. Then there had been confusion and shouting, the cries of the children and the whinnying of animals, all mixed up with the nervous orders of the guides and the merchants. But in the desert, there was only the sound of the eternal wind and of the hoofbeats of the animals. Even the guides spoke very little to each other, right? This is an oasis of like peace. "I've crossed these sands many times," said one of the camel drivers one night, "but the desert is so huge, the horizons so distant, that they make a person feel small, and as if he should remain silent." The boy understood intuitively what he meant, even without ever having set foot in the desert before. Whenever he saw the sea or a fire, he fell silent, impressed by their elemental force. That's a beautiful line, right? Because sometimes the power of the elements take our breath away, because the sea, like being in the forest or looking at a fire, those are like natural elements. Man did not make them, so Like, sometimes just contemplating them in silence, like, reminds you of how expansive the world is and how we should treat our earth better. I've learned things from the sheep, and I've learned things from the crystal, he thought. I can learn something from the desert, too. It seems old and wise. The wind never stopped, and the boy remembered the day he had sat at the fort in Tarifa with the same wind blowing in his face. It reminded him of the wool from his sheep, who were now seeking food and water in the fields of Andalusia as they always had. So he probably misses his sheep right now, right, guys? They're not my sheep anymore, he said to himself without nostalgia. They must be used to their new shepherd, and they've probably already forgotten me. That's good. Creatures like the sheep that are used to traveling, they know about moving on. He thought of the merchant's daughter and was sure that she had probably married by now. Perhaps to a baker or another shepherd who could read or write and tell her all these exciting stories. After all, he probably wasn't the only one. But he was excited at his intuitive understanding of the camel driver's comment. Maybe he was also learning the universal language that deals with the past and the present of all people. Hunches, his mother used to call them. The boy was beginning to understand that intuition is really a sudden immersion of the soul into the universal current of life, where the histories of all people are connected, and we are able to know everything because it's written there.